April 19, 1995, a 9-story federal building in the heart of Oklahoma City. A daycare center on the second floor. Parents have just kissed their children goodbye. At exactly 9:02 in the morning, a rental truck parked on the street below detonates. The northern face of the building collapses in seconds, and 168 people never go home. 19 of them are children, and the man responsible is not a foreign enemy. He is an American, a decorated Gulf War veteran, and in the hours after the explosion, nobody is even looking for him. This is the story of how it happened, why it happened, and what it tells us about a country capable of producing the very forces that destroy it. Pendleton, New York is the kind of town that does not appear on most maps. A rural, mostly white, working-class community of fewer than 2,000 people sitting in the western corner of the state, not far from the old manufacturing city of Buffalo. It is a place where people work with their hands, where privacy is expected, and where distrust of distant institutions has deep roots. This is where Timothy James McVeigh was born, and this is where the first seeds of what would become the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in American history were quietly, invisibly planted. His childhood was not marked by poverty or abuse in any conventional sense. His father worked at a car radiator plant. His mother, described by those who knew her as restless and eager for something different, left the family when Timothy was 10 years old. His 2 sisters went with her. Timothy chose to stay with his father, reportedly because he did not want the man to be alone. That detail is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something essential about the person McVeigh was before ideology got hold of him. He was, by most accounts, a quiet and deeply sensitive child who felt things with an intensity he was not always equipped to process. He became obsessed with guns at an early age, not in the way of a troubled young man, but in the way that was entirely normalized in the rural communities of Western New York in the 1980s. He read survivalist literature. He became convinced, before he was even out of his teens, that the American government was moving toward a kind of totalitarianism that ordinary citizens needed to be prepared to resist. These were ideas that floated freely in certain pockets of America at that time, ideas that had books and radio programs and gathering places dedicated to their circulation, and McVeigh absorbed them with an appetite that, in retrospect, was extraordinary. One book in particular became something close to a sacred text for him. Written in 1978 under a pseudonym by a man named William Luther Pierce, a white nationalist who had spent decades building extremist organizations, the novel depicted a violent insurrection by an underground movement against the federal government. The fictional revolutionaries built a specific kind of bomb, a fertilizer-based device packed into a truck, and used it to destroy a federal building. McVeigh did not simply read this book. He studied it. He sold copies of it at a loss at gun shows across 40 states. He carried it with him the way other people carry a compass. In 1988, McVeigh enlisted in the United States Army, and for a time it seemed as though military life might channel his energy productively. He was, by every account, an exceptional soldier, disciplined, focused, and physically impressive. He served in the Gulf War and was decorated for his performance in combat. He then applied for the Army Special Forces and was rejected. That rejection landed differently on someone who had organized his entire sense of self around the identity of a man who could meet any test placed before him. He accepted early discharge and re-entered civilian life as someone who no longer had a clear place in the world he had believed in. What happened in the years immediately following his discharge is a portrait of slow, deliberate radicalization. He traveled to gun shows across 40 states, and those events were far more than commercial gatherings. In the early 1990s, gun shows functioned as informal meeting points for survivalists, conspiracy theorists, anti-government activists, and malicious sympathizers, places where the literature that McVeigh had been consuming since adolescence was not fringe material, but common currency. He set up tables, sold books, and survival gear, and found in those crowds the affirmation he had not been able to find anywhere else after leaving the Army. He drove across the country, staying in cheap motels and with friends who shared his worldview. And the further he traveled from the coasts, the more he found that his views were not unusual, but simply spoken aloud more freely. He was not becoming someone new. He was becoming more completely the person he had always been underneath, and the world was handing him reasons to justify it. And then, In the summer of 1992, something happened in the mountains of northern Idaho that transformed those convictions into something harder and more dangerous. A white separatist named Randy Weaver had been in a legal dispute with federal agents over a weapons charge. After missing a court date, marshals set up surveillance around his remote property on Ruby Ridge. During a confrontation in the woods, Weaver's 14-year-old son was shot and killed. The following day, an FBI sniper shot and killed Weaver's wife, Vicky, as she stood in the doorway of their cabin holding her infant daughter in her arms. The baby was not harmed. Weaver himself survived and was later acquitted of most charges. For Timothy McVeigh, Ruby Ridge was not an unfortunate series of events in a standoff that had gone wrong. It was confirmation of everything he had believed since adolescence. The image of a federal sniper shooting a woman holding her baby became, in his mind, the definitive image of what the United States government had revealed itself to be. And then, less than a year later, came Waco. In February of 1993, federal agents attempted to serve a search and arrest warrant at a compound outside of Waco, Texas, occupied by a religious sect called the Branch Davidians. The raid went catastrophically wrong. A firefight broke out, and what followed was a 51-day standoff during which agents surrounded the compound and attempted to negotiate with the group's leader. Timothy McVeigh drove to Waco during the standoff and stood outside the barricades distributing anti-government literature. He was interviewed by a journalism student who found him personable and afraid rather than threatening. She would not recognize him again until 3 years later, when his face appeared on every television screen in the country. The standoff ended when federal agents moved in with armored vehicles and tear gas. Fires broke out inside the compound. 76 people died, including 25 children. For McVeigh, what mattered was that the federal government had deployed military force against American citizens and that the general public had largely accepted it. In his mind, Waco confirmed what Ruby Ridge had suggested, that the country was already at war and that only one side was fighting. He had been waiting for a reason to become a soldier again. Now he had two, and he had a blueprint. If you had driven through Junction City, Kansas in the spring of 1995, you have passed through an unremarkable mid-American town built around a military base. The kind of place where rental trucks are leased without ceremony and motel rooms are paid in cash without raising an eyebrow. Nothing about the men moving through that town in those weeks suggested they were building a device capable of destroying a city block. The planning had begun more than a year earlier. McVeigh's collaborator was Terry Nichols, a fellow Army veteran he had met during basic training, more than a decade his senior, a farmer and former soldier from rural Michigan who shared his convictions and his willingness to act on them. It was at Nichols's farm that the conceptual planning first took physical form. Nichols began teaching McVeigh how to mix explosives using materials that were entirely legal to purchase and entirely unregulated. There was a third man in the circle. Michael Fortier was another Army friend who lived with his wife Lori in Arizona. Fortier knew the plan in full. He knew the target, the method, and the timeline, and he did nothing to stop it. According to testimony later given at trial, McVeigh once sat in Fortier's kitchen and used soup cans from the cupboard to demonstrate on the kitchen floor exactly how the barrels of explosive material would be arranged inside the truck to maximize the force directed at the northern wall of the target building. Fortier watched. His wife watched. Neither of them picked up the phone. The target had been chosen carefully and with specific ideological intent. McVeigh and Fortier made a reconnaissance drive to Oklahoma City months before the attack. They parked, walked the perimeter, stood on the sidewalk, and looked up at a building that to anyone else was simply a place where people went to work. They walked around the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, a 9-story structure named for a federal judge from Oklahoma who had been appointed to the bench by Franklin Roosevelt and had served for decades before his death in 1975. The building had opened in 1977, housing the regional operations of more than a dozen federal agencies in a single location. What McVeigh saw when he looked at it was not a public institution that served ordinary people who needed help with their Social Security benefits or their housing applications. He saw the physical embodiment of every agency he held responsible for the events that had transformed him. The building housed the regional offices of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Secret Service, and 9 other federal agencies. In McVeigh's calculus, destroying that building was not an act of mass murder. It was a military strike against a military target, language he would use explicitly for the rest of his life. The acquisition of materials took months and required both planning and crime. Nichols and McVeigh stole blasting caps from a quarry in Kansas. They purchased ammonium nitrate fertilizer in bulk, a routine and entirely unregulated transaction for agricultural buyers at the time, and stored it in rented units across the region. They mixed it with nitromethane racing fuel and diesel oil. They tested smaller devices in the Kansas countryside to calibrate the ratios and timing. The two men operated across multiple states, moving between Kansas, Michigan, and Arizona, maintaining a level of operational separation that made it difficult for anyone who knew one piece of the operation to see the whole picture. By the time they were finished, they had assembled close to 5,000 pounds of explosive material, a device that bomb technicians would later describe as one of the largest ever detonated on American soil. McVeigh rented the truck using a fake name he had constructed from the identity of a soldier he had known in the Army. He was meticulous because he had been trained to be meticulous, and because in some part of his mind he understood that the detail you overlook is the detail that destroys you. He drove to Oklahoma City in advance to park the getaway car several blocks from the federal building, a battered yellow Mercury that would be waiting for him after the truck had served its purpose. He chose the date with the precision of someone who understood that symbolism is a form of communication. April 19th, 1995 was exactly 2 years to the day from the end of the Waco siege. It was also the anniversary of the first battle of the American Revolution, the moment when ordinary citizens first raised arms against what they considered a tyrannical government. In McVeigh's mind, he was not a terrorist. He was a patriot. Wednesday, April 19th, 1995. The morning arrives over Oklahoma City the way spring mornings do on the southern plains, with a clarity that makes everything look clean and specific, the kind of light that makes people feel, for just a moment, that the day ahead will go exactly as planned. At the America's Kids Daycare Center on the second floor of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, the morning drop-off is well underway. A woman named Aaron Allman has just dropped off her daughter Bailey, who turned 1 year old the day before. The family had gathered the previous evening to celebrate, cousins and grandparents and aunts, and the plan was for many more such gatherings in the years ahead. Aaron kisses her daughter goodbye and goes to work. At 9:02 and 3 seconds, a quantity of explosives sufficient to level a city block detonates from the bed of a rented truck parked directly beneath the daycare center. The blast removes the entire northern face of the building in a single moment. 9 stories of office space collapse into each other in what engineers would later describe as a progressive pancake collapse, each floor falling onto the one below it in a cascade of concrete and steel. The crater left in the street is 30 feet wide and 8 feet deep. Windows shatter in buildings more than a mile away. The pressure wave moves outward in every direction simultaneously, and people standing in open streets blocks away are knocked from their feet by something they cannot see before the sound even arrives. The first people who understand what has happened are the ones closest to it, and many of them will spend the rest of their lives trying to describe the initial seconds after the explosion. Survivors buried in rubble on the upper floors called out in the dark to voices they could hear but not locate. First responders arriving in the initial minutes encountered something that had no precedent in their training. The building was still partially standing, which meant there were people alive inside it, but the structure was so compromised that every movement of rescue workers created new dangers for the survivors they were trying to reach. Search dogs were brought in. Listening devices were lowered into the rubble. Workers who found a space they could not see and would call out and wait, sometimes hearing nothing and sometimes hearing everything. More than 12,000 people from across the country would eventually participate in the rescue and recovery effort. They worked for 2 weeks. In the chaos of those first minutes, a 25-year-old bank employee named Charles Porter foreheard what he described as a sonic boom from his office nearby and ran to his car to retrieve the camera he kept in his trunk. Moving through the smoke and wreckage, he saw a firefighter named Chris Fields standing in the middle of the destruction, holding something in his arms. Fields had been on the scene for about an hour when a police officer appeared and placed in his arms the body of a small child pulled from the rubble. Fields checked her airway. He checked for a pulse. He found neither. He held her gently and waited for a paramedic to make room in a crowded ambulance. looking down on her face, thinking about whoever this child's parents were and what was about to happen to their world. Charles Porter took the photograph. It was developed at a nearby pharmacy and submitted to the Associated Press. Within 24 hours, it was on the front page of newspapers in more than 100 countries. The following morning, Aaron Allman recognized the outfit. She called her daughter's pediatrician, who confirmed what she already knew. Bailey was one of 19 children who did not survive the morning. She had been 1 year old for exactly 1 day. Meanwhile, in television studios across the country, a different story was being told with complete confidence. Within hours of the explosion, major networks were reporting that Middle Eastern terrorists were responsible. The logic seemed clear: a federal building, a massive bomb, and the fresh memory of a foreign terrorist attack on American soil just 2 years earlier pointed the same direction in every newsroom simultaneously. A Jordanian-American man who happened to be traveling from Oklahoma City that morning was detained and questioned at Chicago's O'Hare Airport. The wrong story circulated for 2 full days. The right story began to emerge from a single small detail that had survived the blast against all probability. Approximately 78 miles north of Oklahoma City, 90 minutes after the explosion, a state trooper named Charlie Hanger noticed a yellow Mercury with no rear license plate moving north on Interstate 35. He pulled it over. The driver was cooperative in a way that Hanger, an experienced officer, found notable. Almost eerily so. When Hanger asked him to step out of the vehicle, he noticed the outline of a weapon beneath the man's jacket. The driver was carrying a loaded .45 caliber Glock in a quick-draw holster, along with a spare magazine and a knife. He had no permit. Hanger arrested him for carrying a concealed weapon and drove him to the county jail. The jailer noted later that the man's hands did not sweat during fingerprinting. He watched television coverage of the bombing from the booking room without making a single comment. His name was Timothy McVeigh, and he had been in custody for an hour and a half before anyone connected him to the crater on Northwest 5th Street. The day after the bombing, buried beneath the rubble of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, investigators found a piece of metal. It was the rear axle of the rental truck, twisted and scorched, but intact enough to retain a partial vehicle identification number, the unique code stamped onto vehicle components that exists precisely for moments like this one. That number led agents to a rental franchise at a body shop in Junction City, Kansas. The employees who had interacted with the man who rented the truck sat down with FBI sketch artists and produced a composite image. Agents spread out across town, showing that composite to every business in the area. The manager of a nearby motel recognized the face immediately and gave them a name: Tim McVeigh. A check of that name in the National Criminal Database returned a result that stopped the investigation in its tracks. Timothy McVeigh was not a fugitive. He was not in hiding. He was sitting in a county jail in Perry, Oklahoma, booked 2 days earlier on a weapons misdemeanor, approximately 48 hours away from being released and disappearing entirely. The investigation that followed, codenamed Akbom, became the largest criminal case in American history at that time. Agents conducted 28,000 interviews. They followed more than 43,000 leads. They collected 3.5 tons of physical evidence and reviewed close to 1 billion individual pieces of information. 900 federal, state, and local law enforcement personnel were deployed simultaneously. The scope was extraordinary, and it was driven by a simple imperative: whoever had done this needed to be understood completely, not just convicted. What emerged was a picture of McVeigh's network that was simultaneously broader and narrower than anyone had expected. Broader because of the ideological world that had shaped him. The gun shows, the extremist literature, the militia culture that had been building throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, intensified by the events that had broken McVeigh open and the federal assault weapons ban enacted the previous year. Narrower because the actual operational conspiracy was small. 3 men and 1 woman. McVeigh, who planned and carried out the attack. Nichols, who helped build the bomb. Fortier, who knew everything and said nothing. And Fortier's wife, Lori, who later testified that she had personally laminated the fake identification McVeigh used to rent the truck. Terry Nichols surrendered voluntarily when his name surfaced. Michael Fortier agreed to testify for the prosecution in exchange for a reduced sentence, and his account, combined with that of his wife, closed the crucial gaps that physical evidence alone could not. Traces of the same chemical compounds used in the bomb were found in McVeigh's clothing at the time of his arrest. The business card found on the floor of Trooper Hanger's patrol car after McVeigh was handcuffed bore the name of a military surplus store in Wisconsin, and on the back, in McVeigh's own handwriting, were words indicating he intended to acquire more explosive materials after the attack. It had been written in anticipation of a second strike. McVeigh said almost nothing from a moment of his identification. He cooperated the way a soldier cooperates when captured, offering his name and the legal minimum, nothing else. He showed no remorse. In interviews conducted years later, after his conviction, he described the deaths of the children in the daycare center as collateral damage, the same term used by military planners to describe civilian casualties in warfare. He said he had not known the daycare center was there. When pressed on whether that knowledge would have changed his decision, he gave answers that were studied and deliberately ambiguous. He did not want to be seen as someone who regretted what he had done. He wanted to be seen as a soldier who had calculated and accepted the costs of a military operation, and he held that posture until the end. What was perhaps most disturbing to those who followed the case closely was not the absence of remorse, which is common enough in people who have committed acts of mass violence, but the coherence of his worldview. He was not erratic. He was not confused. He had a framework, and within that framework, everything he had done made sense to him, which is a different and in some ways more unsettling thing than madness. The trial was moved from Oklahoma City to Denver on the grounds that no jury pool in Oklahoma could be considered impartial. The prosecution presented 137 witnesses over the course of weeks of testimony. McVeigh was convicted on all 11 counts. The death penalty was formally imposed. Nichols was tried separately and received 8 consecutive federal life sentences, followed by 161 additional life sentences from the state of Oklahoma, one for each non-federal victim, with no possibility of parole. Michael Fortier served 12 years and entered the Federal Witness Protection Program upon his release. On June 11, 2001, Timothy McVeigh was executed by lethal injection at the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana, the first federal execution in the United States since 1963. A closed-circuit feed was established in Oklahoma City so that survivors and family members who chose to watch could do so without being in the same room as the man who had destroyed their lives. He offered no final statement. He was 33 years old. He had chosen April 19, 1995 as the day the government would understand what it had done. What the government understood, in the end, was that he had killed 168 people and accomplished nothing beyond that. In the months after the bombing, something unexpected happened at the fence. The chain-link barrier erected around the ruins of the McVeigh building to keep people away from the unstable structure quickly became something else entirely. People began leaving things on it. A teddy bear tied to a fence post, a photograph in a plastic sleeve, a child's drawing pressed against a chain link and held there by a twist of wire. Within days, the fence was covered. Within weeks, it was something that people drove hundreds of miles to see, not because it was beautiful, because it was not, but because it was honest. It was the unmediated expression of a city telling itself and the world that it had been here, that it had lost something irreplaceable, and that it was not going to pretend otherwise. That fence, or rather a preserved section of it, is now part of the permanent memorial that stands on the ground where the McVeigh building once stood. And standing inside that memorial today, 30 years after the morning that shattered this city, it becomes clear that the people who built it understood something important. That the purpose of memorial is not to explain what happened. It is to ensure that the people to whom it happened are never reduced to a number. The numbers carry a weight that is difficult to absorb all at once. 219 children lost at least one parent that morning. 30 were completely orphaned. 7,000 people lost their workplace in a single explosion. The blast damaged or destroyed more than 300 buildings across 48 city blocks. But numbers, as staggering as they are, do not contain the story. The story is in the individuals, and there are 168 of them, each one specific and irreplaceable and refusing to be summarized. There was Rebecca Anderson, a nurse who ran toward the building after the explosion to help survivors trapped in the rubble. A piece of debris struck her on the head. She died 4 days later, and her organs were donated. Her heart was transplanted into a survivor of the bombing who had been critically injured in the blast. She is one of the 168 chairs. There was a child named P.J. Allen, who was less than 2 years old when the daycare center came down around him. He had broken bones, burns over more than half of his body, and lung damage that required a tracheotomy tube in his throat until he was 10 years old. He was one of only 6 children from the daycare center to survive. He has spoken publicly about the experience in the years since, describing the physical limitations he still lives with not as burdens, but as the price of the gift of survival, a framing that requires a kind of generosity of spirit that is almost impossible to comprehend from the outside. In July of 1997, a design was chosen from more than 600 submissions for the Oklahoma City National Memorial. The husband and wife team selected to build it had spent weeks before submitting their design, reading the biographies of all 168 people who had died. They did not start with aesthetics. They started with names and lives, and the memorial they designed reflects that starting point at every level. The reflecting pool occupies the space where Northwest 5th Street once ran, the exact stretch of road where the truck had been parked. At each end of the pool stands a gate, and on each gate is a single time. On one side, 9:01. On the other, 9:03. The minute before and the minute after. The space of water and air between the gates holds that moment in a permanent suspension, so that anyone standing in the memorial is always standing in the 2 minutes that bracket the end of one world and the beginning of another. The field of empty chairs is the center of the memorial. 168 chairs, each crafted individually from glass, bronze, and stone, arranged in 9 rows corresponding to the 9 floors of the building that once stood here. Each chair sits on the row corresponding to the floor where that person was standing at 9:02. Each chair bears a name in the glass base, and at night the chairs are illuminated from within, so that the field glows with 168 individual lights. 19 of the chairs are smaller than the rest. Those are the children. The survivor tree is an American elm that stood approximately 100 feet from the point of detonation. The blast stripped it of most of its bark and embedded debris deep into its trunk. Every emergency worker who saw it in the days following the attack assumed it was dead. The following spring, it bloomed. It has bloomed every spring since. Seeds from the survivor tree are collected each year and germinated, and the resulting saplings are given away on the anniversary of the bombing to anyone who wants one. Thousands of survivor trees are now growing in parks and schoolyards and private gardens across the country. The tree that should not have survived is now, in a very literal sense, everywhere. The bombing reshaped the physical relationship between federal buildings and public spaces in ways that most people now take entirely for granted. The concrete bollards and granite barriers that line the perimeters of government buildings across American cities, features of the urban landscape that most people accept without question, are in many cases direct descendants of the lessons of April 19th, 1995. Setback requirements, mandating the minimum distance between a building's entrance and the nearest point where a vehicle can stop, were dramatically increased at all federal properties in the years following the attack. Blast-resistant window glazing, reinforced construction standards, and perimeter security protocols that are now considered baseline requirements were all adopted in direct response to what happened here. The security architecture of modern American public life was permanently altered by a single morning in Oklahoma City. Those who survived the bombing, and those who lost people in it, have spent 3 decades doing the difficult and ongoing work of figuring out what it means to carry that morning with them through every day that follows. Chris Fields, the firefighter in the photograph, has said that the weight of what he witnessed finally caught up with him nearly a decade after the event, that the survivor's guilt and compounding grief arrived in ways he had not anticipated, and that it took years of deliberate effort to find his way back. Aaron Allman, who was 22 years old when she buried her daughter, has said that the photograph made Bailey a symbol, but that Bailey was a real child, a specific and unrepeatable person, and that this is the distinction she has spent 30 years insisting upon, not because the world is wrong to remember the image, but because her daughter deserved to be more than one. The survivor tree blooms every spring. The 168 lights come on every evening at dusk. The gates mark 9:01 and 9:03, as they always have and always will. And the question that the memorial asks of everyone who stand within it, not in words, but in the arrangement of light and water and stone and empty space, is whether the people of that morning are remembered as they actually were, not as symbols, not as arguments for any cause or position, not as casualties in a debate that has continued without them, but as the specific and irreplaceable human beings who dropped their children at daycare and poured their coffee and sat down at their desks on an ordinary Wednesday morning in April, believing, as we all must believe in order to live, that the day ahead would go exactly as planned.